Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are talking about how it looks like a new Nintendo Switch 2 model and more just leaked. A lot of people have been freaking out about this news of a new Switch 2 OLED model that's in the works that could be coming out as soon as late 2027. But there's more going on than just this apparently. We have some evidence to suggest that the Nintendo is working on fixing the variable refresh rate on the Switch 2. We already have VRR in handheld mode, but we were also initially promised to have VRR in docked mode, and that hasn't been the case, but Nintendo may be working on this. And then on top of that, we did talk about this a little while back, but apparently there is another Switch 2 out there with a new LCD panel. Some sort of quiet revision also seems to be in the works here, and is possibly related to the revisions we'll be seeing coming out in Europe that have to do with the new change in regulations there, where consumers need to be easily able to replace the battery. So there's a few different things going on here, and when I think about what's to come in 2027, such as perhaps a new 3D Mario, as some leaks have been supporting, and also Pokémon Winds and Waves, there could be some significant revisions planned for that third fiscal year Switch 2. Not too different from how Nintendo handled things with Switch 1 when we saw the release of the Switch Lite, and also another quiet revision. So there's a lot going on here, and so we're going to be diving into it all today. Before doing so though, let me simply remind you all I have this goal to reach 60,000 subscribers, and we're getting so close. I'm hoping to hit this goal soon, so if you find yourself enjoying my videos and you haven't subscribed already, I would appreciate your subscription. So this news of a Nintendo Switch 2 OLED model being in the works is coming from ZDNet Korea. As you can see here, they're reporting that Nintendo's considering the release of a Switch 2 OLED, and the idea is that this would be coming out, or they'll begin mass production as early as the end of 2027, and if not, by the beginning of 2028. And I find this interesting from a few different perspectives. One, this could be indicating we'll be seeing a Switch 2 OLED before there's even a Switch 2 Lite. Which, if you think about it, with the Switch 1 came out March 2017, and then in September of 2019, 2.5 years later, we got the Switch Lite, and it wasn't until 2 years after that, October of 2021, is when we saw the Switch OLED come out. And so if we see a Switch 2 OLED come out in the latter half of 2027, which would just be about 2.5 years after the release of the Switch 2, and it's an OLED as opposed to a Lite, that would be an interesting change of pace there. But something else I consider with this, I don't think an OLED screen that would be at the same resolution, because that's what we're reporting here, that it would be a 1080p resolution just like the current Switch 2 screen, an OLED screen would be that much of an improvement, because a Switch 2 screen is actually a lot better than what we saw on Switch 1. Not only is it a larger screen that's at a higher resolution, but it also runs at a higher frame rate, 120 Hz. We can see 120 FPS games on the console. It also has a variable refresh rate, so we can see games running at 40 FPS, for example, and that can certainly have some pretty big benefits depending on the game. And it's also very vibrant. It's not old LCD technology. It's not like the Switch 1 LCDs. This is a newer LCD that has very colorful, vibrant screens. And so I think that draw of the OLED, where it's super colorful, it has those really strong blacks, those really great contrasts. Like, yes, an OLED would be an improvement over what we have for Switch 2 now, but the gap, that drastic improvement over what we saw for Switch 1 LCD screens, would be not nearly as substantial. And so I think it would actually be a little odd if Nintendo were to release a Switch 2 OLED and the main draw is just the OLED screen. It wouldn't be as much of a draw anymore. Of course, I'm making the assumption here that that's the only draw here. Maybe they're going to position it as more of a Switch 2 Pro. In that case, maybe OLED is just part of the package there, and it has better performance, maybe it offers other features. Then all of a sudden, I would start to think it makes more sense, but it's not just about the draw of the OLED screen, but just an overall improvement with other features involved. So possibly, this report here from ZDNet Korea that has multiple sources supposedly, this could be some insight into us actually getting a Switch 2 Pro. Maybe it's just a Switch 2 OLED. I'm not making any promises here. I'm just telling you, in my opinion, the idea of Nintendo just releasing a Switch 2 OLED, considering the improvements we've seen with the Switch 2 screen already, doesn't seem like enough of a draw in my opinion. Something interesting to consider here are the kinds of features a Switch 2 Pro would have. Sure, more horsepower, OLED screen, but what else? Maybe a better battery. That's certainly a possibility. But what else? Well, maybe with that extra horsepower, maybe if there's more RAM involved and things of that nature, there's other things that can be done. Like something I've been thinking about lately, because I've been using game chat. You can watch someone else's screen, and you can even have like a cursor on your screen when you're using mouse mode, and that's cool. But what would be even cooler is if during game chat, you could actually interact with your friend's screen when watching them. Like they could see your cursor on screen, so you can make different indications while they're playing. It would be even crazier if they allowed you to interact with the camera to see things from a different angle during game chat. I know that would be extra, I'm not even sure that's possible, but at least the cursor thing, that feels kind of plausible to me, and maybe a Switch 2 Pro could actually push game chat to a little bit of a greater level. So imagine a Switch 2 Pro with an OLED screen, better battery, more game chat features, and VRR, in not just handheld mode, but also docked mode. Maybe at that point, Nintendo might feel a bit better about selling this as a premium for some users who are ready to upgrade from their base Switch 2s. But also on the note of Switch 2 Pro stuff, I remember all the Switch 1 Pro stuff. There's a lot of conversation about that stuff, and nothing actually came to light. We never actually saw anything see the light of day. So I just want to point out, let's pump the brakes a little bit here. We're having a discussion. We're speculating based off things we're hearing about here. There is some evidence for some other things I'll be getting into in a moment, but we don't know exactly what's happening. ZDNet Korea is not even claiming this is happening 100%. They're simply stating that Nintendo is considering it. Considering doesn't mean it's going to happen for sure. So keep that in mind. Take this with a grain of salt. And that's even assuming these sources here are accurate. They may not be. But this is what we do have some evidence for. Literally on Nintendo's career page, they have a job posting, or they're trying to hire for a role for a senior engineer having to do with displays. And one of the preferred requirements here is having knowledge of display technologies such as HDR and VRR. This is a big deal because why are you hiring a senior engineer to work on HDR and VRR if you don't need any more work for that to be done? Well, maybe it's because there is more work to be done here, and they do want to continue to work on getting VRR working. VRR is working in handheld mode for Switch 2, but initially there was a promise that VRR would also work in docked mode, and that's not actually the case, so maybe they're looking for ways to get that working. And perhaps it's something we won't be able to see until there are revisions of the Switch 2, maybe in this new Switch 2 OLED thing we're hearing about from ZDNet Korea. I'll say it would be really great to see this in docked mode. We're seeing a lot of awesome AAA ports on Switch 2, a lot of games looking and running great on the console, but there's a lot of games that can't hit that 60 FPS target, and so they just go down to 30. But if VRR was something they could support not just in handheld mode, but docked mode, we could see a lot of games target 40 FPS in docked mode, when 60 FPS isn't a realistic target, which, yeah, would be a smoother experience than just 30 frames per second. So Nintendo finding a way to get this working in more Switch 2s, I think, would be a pretty important thing to do. Now, something else that has been going on that I feel like is somewhat relevant here is that we did hear about, and Nintendo Patents Watch was the one that discovered this, that surfaced from a Chinese resale site a new model for the Switch 2 LCD panel. They think it's most likely by Sharp. This would be suggesting that there is some kind of revision in the works that wouldn't be OLED, by the way, and could be coming out sooner. Now, my opinion of this, it's not going to be like a big revision where Nintendo's going to be like putting out new commercials with all these new features of this new version of the Switch 2. They may not even change the box if this goes out there. Maybe this is something that's being done to handle the VRR issues. Maybe this is something that's being done to handle reports we've gotten about there being ghosting, where you see a little bit of a blurring on some of your screens. I haven't noticed this issue myself, but a lot of people have talked about it. So maybe this is something Nintendo is looking into, and that's why they're considering some revisions for the LCD screen. It also could tie into what we've heard about regarding Nintendo needing to put out a revision, which is already officially announced, for models in Europe, because due to some regulation changes, consumers need to have the option of user replaceable batteries. So Nintendo's going to be rolling out Switch 2 revisions in Europe where it's easy to replace those batteries. Maybe they're going to take this as an opportunity to also fix up the LCD screen. That's possible. Maybe to fix the ghosting issues, maybe to give us more options with VRR, maybe. A point I would like to make, though, about all of this talk regarding different revisions for the Switch 2 and different models we might see down the road, is just thinking about what's to come next year. And I've talked about this before it was confirmed when this would be coming out, and that's Pokémon Winds and Waves. Pokémon Winds and Waves is not coming out until next year, and there's even some talk that it won't be coming out until later next year. And I think this is something really important to consider because there is a history with there being new generation of Pokemon games and new revisions for handheld Nintendo devices. One example, Pokemon Sword and Shield came out in 2019. You wanna know what else released in 2019? The Switch Lite. A very portable version of the Switch that appealed to a wider audience. They wouldn't necessarily be willing to put up as much money for a normal Switch, but for a Switch Lite that's more approachable, more along the lines of a typical Nintendo handheld, that definitely facilitated more Pokemon sales. I would not be surprised if Nintendo's considering this, and they're going to be pairing up a new revision of Switch 2 sometime around the release of Pokemon Winds and Waves next year. And we're seeing all this different evidence pop up for different changes we could see to the Switch 2. Maybe some of this is tied into a revision. I wonder if it could be a Switch 2 Lite. Maybe they don't necessarily feel like they have to do a Lite version this time, but some sort of change. I actually think it does make sense to put out a Switch 2 Lite, at least from the perspective of reaching a larger audience here, because the Switch 2 is certainly more expensive than prior Nintendo consoles. If Nintendo could find a way to strip down some of the features, make it a little bit smaller, put out a cheaper screen at a cheaper price point, that might be great to get a lot more people invested into the Switch 2 and also available to buy Pokemon Winds and Waves when it comes out sometime next year. Not too different from how they handled the Switch 1 Lite in 2019. But now it just seems a little bit more needed just because of how expensive prices are. At the same time though, this is kind of saying it's happening across the board, and a Switch 2 Lite would still be more expensive than a Switch 1 Lite. Before closing out here, let me just say, I love my Nintendo Switch 2, as it is pretty much for the most part. I don't plan on picking up any revisions soon. I don't need a revision soon. It's interesting that there's all this talk of a revision of some sort, a Switch 2 Pro, a Switch 2 Lite, the different versions are sending out to Europe, some sort of new LCD, all that is interesting, but I personally think I'm going to be good with my Switch 2 as it is, maybe for the entire generation. I say that because that's literally what I did with the Switch 1. However, I will admit, once they got around to 2025, I really felt like I needed a new Switch, so I was very happy when I finally got to pick up my Switch 2, and I love it as it is. I think the screen is great. I haven't personally experienced any real problems with this ghosting that some people have reported on. I feel like all the games have been running well. I like how the console feels, the Joy-Cons are amazing, I like the mouse mode, the game chat. I just think the Switch 2 is a really good system. So I'm personally not clamoring for a revision anytime soon. However, I'm going to talk about this stuff because, well, it's certainly interesting, it's my job, and I'm going to talk about Switch 2. So here we are talking about all this stuff, but I personally just don't really feel like it's needed. The console as it is a really good system, and maybe Nintendo might see it that way as well, and so that could go into how they handle their revisions in the future on top of that. Like earlier I talked about how maybe with a Switch 2 OLED, they would actually position it more as like a Switch 2 Pro so it could have more of a draw and the other added features, but maybe that's not how they're going to look at things. Maybe they'll just introduce a Switch 2 OLED. It'll only just be a marginal price increase, so some people who really want that OLED screen have been waiting for it, and it will be fine just as is. Perhaps even they would phase out the base Switch 2 and they would just go with that model moving forward, maybe even at the same price point. But that's all assuming this report is true, and if the report is true, we wouldn't see this until at the earliest the end of 2027, which is still a year and a half from now, and that's at the earliest, according to the report. I will say though, I do want VRR support in docked mode, which might be possible through an update, we'll see. But what do you all think? Do you think we're going to get a Switch 2 Lite next year alongside Pokemon Winds and Waves? Do you think there's something to this report about a Switch 2 OLED being in the works? Do you think Nintendo is working on just some quiet revisions here and it's not going to really be that big of a deal? Is it all of the above? Or something else? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.